Hey everybody, it's Corporal Speculation bringing you my latest episode. And today I want to talk a little bit about the rise of radicals in our politic, in our body politic of the United States. And I want to talk about it from a broad sense. I think a lot of people hit it, facing left or facing right and criticizing one side or the other. I don't see a lot of people talking about how these two sides kind of almost play off of each other. And that's kind of what I wanted to get into. So before we start, I thought it'd be helpful to define terms a little bit and give a little bit of history on the subject. For the last about 150 years, we've been watching the exact same thing that we're watching in the United States play out across the world. Any regime that you can think of that went totalitarian, whether you're thinking about the Nazis or the communists in Russia or, the Chinese, Spain, Italy, it's very easy to point to the regimes that ended up taking power and committing, atrocities. But there's not a ton of thought, which it makes sense. When you get done with, massive human rights abuses, it's very easy to condemn the communists in the Soviet Union and not think about, the radical right wingers that had the communists all worked up when they took power. And it's easy not to think about the communists in 1930s Germany, and how, maybe the communists did kind of cost Germany the war for World War One, and there was a reason why there was all that anger. It's very easy to just point the finger at the one who took power and did the bad thing, but I think it's important structurally to understand that with a lot of these radical ideologies, once you really look into it, what you'll find is one of the key motivating principles is the radicals on the other side. And these two organizations, they don't work together per se, but it's necessary to have them both in order to recruit people into one side or the other, right? So you're not going to have any luck in a well-run society with two moderate, likable political sides, converting mass numbers of people into fascism or communism. You're just not. But if there's a good chunk of communists on the other side and they're scaring the crap out of people, well, then it's going to be pretty easy to get people to jump over to fascism, and vice versa. So it's important to understand that these types of organizations, they do run together. And then another thing I want to talk about is I really don't think there's all that many super radicals in the United States. I think what it is really that's happening is that our political center has completely rotted out, and it's not that crazy that if you're a Republican, and you just want taxes to be lower and you want your right to your guns, and you want to be left alone, and you think, oh, I'm pretty moderate Republican, and then you look at some of the more extreme wings of the Republican Party, the populist wings, like Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, that circle, and then you look over to the moderate side and you see Mitch McConnell or Lindsey Graham, but you just say, I don't know, I'm going with Trump, man. And then the exact same phenomenon is happening on the left. Say you're like a minorly left of center person, you don't mind paying as much as taxes, but you do want a little bit of a social safety net, um, but you're just a mild average liberal. And you look at the moderate wing of the party and you see Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. And then you look at the extreme wing and then you see Bernie Sanders and AOC. You go, I guess I'm extremist. And I'm here to say, like, that's not necessarily true. It's just kind of that the middle is awful in our country. And it's not crazy that if you see how much the federal government spends, that you come away with one of two conclusions, right? Either I don't mind, my taxes being what they are and you guys spending as much as you do, but I would like an awful lot more stuff, and I think that's kind of the left wing answer. Or the right wing answer, which is, I don't really get anything from this massive organization. You guys spend so much money and I don't see any of the benefit. I would like to put a lot less money into this organization. I don't really want anything to do with it. And really, I think at this point, those are the two rational takeaways from a federal government that we have to work 3 months of the year just to pay our taxes to. And, for the vast majority of people, especially if we're employed in the private sector, when the government shuts down, we don't see any difference. If somebody breaks into my house, I'll call the local police. If I need to drive to Walmart, it's the local government that paves the roads. The federal government does almost nothing for me, but they're my number one expense is paying my federal taxes. Um, so I totally get both sides, and I think we should all try and strive to get each other and understand that there really is no need for the extremes that we're seeing. It's just kind of that the extremes are the only ones that are doing anything resembling a decent job of recruiting. But I don't think that needs to be the case. The United States was founded on, we have all the tools to make a really well functioning government. If you look back at the Constitution, and states' rights and things of that nature. And I know, there have been some mistakes with states' rights, but for the most part, I think, liberals right now are living under Donald Trump and he's occupying left wing cities. And Republicans remember when they couldn't put a post up on Facebook without getting taken down and finding out that was Joe Biden's, administration putting pressure on Facebook to make that happen. We're both kind of have a pretty decent idea of what it's like to live under the heel of a strong opposite aligned government, and it's not great, and it doesn't need to be that way. If we make the federal government small and we lean on states' rights and we have some universal values to speech and assembly, and things of that nature, and then let the states decide, what it is, what kind of policies they want, that's much more of a republic. And that's a much more sustainable government instead of this 50-50 winner take all, we're going to dominate and put down the other side. It doesn't need to be like that, but we have to agree on both sides that, that the executives become too powerful, the federal government's become too powerful, and we think that the power, should be with the states or even local administrations as much as humanly possible and get away from this, one small group of human beings in Washington, D.C., deciding so much for the rest of us. It just doesn't need to be like that. And the country wasn't designed to work like that, and there's so many examples of how it's just distorting everything. So I just wanted to kind of sell you guys on, let's all kind of walk back towards the middle. Can we make a state where the liberals and the conservatives are both pretty happy? Where if you live in New York and it's a pretty left wing state government, you live under pretty left wing policies and you're okay with that. But if you live in Florida and it's a deep red state and you've got pretty red policies, the Floridians decide that, and that's okay. It doesn't need to be, everybody's controlling everything that everyone does, and I think that that's how you take the temperature down. It's like right now we are wrestling over control over a nuclear bomb in the federal government, and we're getting more and more desperate because we're more and more terrified that the opposite side's going to take over and then kind of ruin our lives. And I'm here to tell you, historically, that does happen. This argument, when it gets out of control and somebody does end up deciding to push it as far as possible, and you end up with a totalitarian communist or a totalitarian fascist state, those are founded fears. That is a thing that can happen, right? But the answer isn't to go the opposite way. Us regular folk, we don't make out well either way. It always works out bad if we go to totalitarianism. The answer is we got to take the power out of Washington, right? We got to end the fight over the nuclear bomb by getting rid of it and just live and let live. Let's get back to that type of mindset and decide. I mean, that's what it is. I mean, if I had my druthers, how it would look is look like the country was designed to function with some, voucher style programs like food stamps. And really that's about it. But maybe you want more, maybe you want less. I mean, it makes sense, but like put some thought into that. Like, how could this work in a way where everyone would be happy? And I think historically we got to figure out a way to get off this track of accumulating power in the executive, because we've seen this movie before. I'm telling you, and every single time, if it's fascist Italy, there was communists there. Fascist Spain, there was a whole French or Spanish Civil War, where Americans were going over there and fighting on the side of the communists against the fascist regime, and the fascists won, and it turned into an absolute bloodbath. Same thing in China with Taiwan versus China and the Chinese Civil War. On one side you have the right, and on the other side you have the left. I mean, these conflicts have broken out badly before. And the answer isn't, the communists, I really don't want them because they're terrifying, so I have to join the fascist movement. It works out poorly for everybody regardless. The system that works and the system that generates prosperity is one with individual liberty, and where people can just kind of live their lives, and I want to get back to that. I guess what I would say to, if you know anybody that's kind of have these extremist views, is ask them about it. You know what I'm saying? If you're an extremist left wing, and their arguments sound like Hugo Chavez's arguments, well, how do we know that it's going to go differently than it did in Venezuela? You know, and then on the flip side, if they've got these sort of far right wing views like Nick Fuentes and stuff like that, it's like, all right, well, if you guys take power, how do we know it's not going to go like Mussolini or like Franco in Spain? you know? And wouldn't we all be better off? Wouldn't it be easier for everybody if we just took some power away from the federal government, put it into the states, and then the states kind of got to decide what the laws look like in the state that you live in? And then if you don't really like those rules, well, you can move to one of the states that are oppositely aligned, and you're going to have a much better time than when, every 4 years it flips, and then you've got Joe Biden in charge, and your Facebook posts are being taken down, and he's tapping the phones of U.S. senators in Arctic frost, and then it flips to Donald Trump, and he's sending in the military to occupy cities. And it does. Let's stop the cycle of escalation, and the only way off this train is back towards a rights-based society where you just kind of live and let live. Let people live the way that they want to. Let's focus on peace. Let's focus on prosperity. Let's focus on liberty. Let people do what they want. And let's all make as much money as we can. And it doesn't have to be worse than that, And I get that they're attractive, but also, look at the political extreme on your side. Look at the type of government that they're actually advocating for, and then develop a little bit of an allergy towards that, right? It's very easy for, a right winger to criticize a communist or a left winger to criticize a fascist. Hits a lot harder when a right winger criticizes a fascist and a left winger criticizes a communist. And you should know the line of, I want a slightly right of center government, and then this crosses into, a government that's an extreme totalitarian state, and then the opposite on the opposite side. So I mean, I think that's kind of my takeaway for the extremists, but remember also, if you do consider yourself as one of these political extremes, just also remember that there's no greater recruiting tool, for the extreme of the other side than you. In fact, these organizations can't get off the ground without each other. It's two wings of the same bird, and we as a U.S. citizenry, I think, have a responsibility to the future, to our kids, grandkids, and future generations to, not let one of these two sides win, and remake the country into something that it was never meant to be. So that's my take on the rise of political extremes. I hope you guys like it. If you want to throw me a like, a subscribe, a comment, if you think I got it wrong, please feel free to let me know. And I hope everybody just has the best Saturday. Have a great day.